My name is Kerry Love, and if you want to understand why a Tuesday morning envelope nearly brought me to my knees, not from grief, but from pure, cold fury, then you need to understand where I came from first. I grew up in Liberty City, on the northwest side of Miami, in a neighborhood that the rest of the city has always talked about more than it has ever truly seen. My mother worked double shifts at Jackson Memorial Hospital for 22 years. My father left when I was 9 and took nothing with him except the illusion that our household needed him to function. What he left behind was a woman of extraordinary quiet strength, a younger brother who idolized me, and a lesson I absorbed before I was old enough to name it, that the only architecture worth building is the kind that stands after everything tries to knock it down. Here's a more emotional and powerful version while keeping it warm and sincere. Hi, my loyal family. Welcome back to your own home, Mr. Peter Stories. I can't tell you how much I've missed you. Being away from you felt like being away from my own family. Today, I'm starting again from zero, and I need your love and support more than ever. If you believe in me, please like, share, subscribe, and watch the story until the very end. Every single view and every minute you watch helps this family grow stronger. In the coming days, I'll be sharing a special prayer from my heart for every one of you. May God bless you and your families with peace, health, happiness, and endless success. Thank you for standing with me. Let's build this journey together, one story at a time. I discovered interior design by accident at 17, flipping through a discarded magazine in the hospital waiting room while my mother finished her shift. Something about the way a well-considered room could hold a human being, could make a person feel seen and sheltered and elevated all at once, reached into me and did not let go. I studied on a partial scholarship at Miami-Dade College, then worked for 7 years under a senior designer in Coral Gables, learning every corner of the trade before I was ready to build something of my own. 2 years ago, I signed the lease on my studio space on Northwest 2nd Avenue in Wynwood, with a bank account that had exactly 4 months of runway in it. I furnished it modestly, hired Priya as a part-time assistant, and began the slow, serious work of becoming the designer I had always known I was capable of being. The neighborhood suited me. Wynwood had rebuilt itself from abandonment into something vivid and purposeful, and I understood that transformation in my bones. By the Tuesday the envelope arrived, I had a growing client list, 2 completed residential projects that had been featured in a regional design publication, and a reputation that was beginning to travel on its own. I was not wealthy. I was not famous. But I was building something real, with my own hands, on my own terms, which made what was inside that envelope so particularly calculated. I noticed it the moment I arrived at my studio that morning, sitting alone in the brass mailbox beside my glass door, thick and cream-colored, sealed with burgundy wax. I assumed it was a vendor invitation, the kind that arrives in elaborate packaging to justify an elaborate price. I tucked it under my arm, unlocked the studio, set my coffee on the work table, and opened it without ceremony. The card inside was heavy stock, gold embossed lettering, the kind of stationery selected not to communicate joy, but to communicate arrival. Rovman James Lewis and Sloane Margaret Whitfield request the honor of your presence at their wedding celebration, Villa Casa Casuarina, Ocean Drive, Miami Beach. I read it once, then I read it again. Rovman Lewis, the man I had given 4 years of my life to, the man who had sat across from me in the kitchen of his Coral Gables home, a home I had helped him furnish, room by room, with the unconscious tenderness of a woman who believes she is building something permanent, and dismantled everything in 11 minutes. He told me I was too ambitious, that I was difficult to build a future with, that he needed someone who understood the kind of world he was moving into. The following morning, A cardboard box appeared on his front step with my belongings stacked inside it. He was not home when I arrived to collect it. He did not call. He did not text. He simply closed the door on 4 years and walked away into the life he had apparently been quietly designing without me. That was 18 months ago. I had not heard his name spoken directly to me since. Behind the invitation, tucked with the deliberateness of a man who had rehearsed this moment, was a small personal note card, his handwriting, careful, controlled cursive that I had once found charming and now recognized as pure performance. "Kerry, I wanted you to see what happiness looks like." I set the card down on my work table. I picked up my coffee. I stood at my window and looked out at Northwest 2nd Avenue, the murals climbing the walls of the building across the street, the delivery truck idling at the corner, the neighborhood moving through its ordinary Tuesday morning with no awareness whatsoever that something in my atmosphere had just shifted dramatically. Let me be honest with you, because this story deserves honesty from its very first breath. I was not heartbroken standing at that window. What I felt was something far colder and far more useful than heartbreak. I felt the specific, clarifying fury of a woman who recognizes a trap that has been built around an outdated image of her. Rovman had constructed this invitation around a version of Kerry love that no longer existed. The diminished, solitary, quietly suffering woman he had imagined me becoming after he left. He wanted to look across the magnificent mosaic courtyard of Villa Casa Casuarina and find her standing there, alone, a piece of quiet evidence that his decision had been correct and his life had flourished while hers had not. He had miscalculated. Priya arrived at 8:30 and found me at my work table with the invitation propped against my coffee mug and a legal pad open in front of me. She looked at the card, looked at my face, and exercised the excellent professional judgment she always demonstrated by saying nothing. "Clear my calendar for that Saturday," I told her. "The Henderson consultation is, move it to Friday afternoon." She made a note and went to her desk. I turned the invitation over one more time, studying the venue choice with the eye of someone who understands what spaces are designed to communicate. Villa Casa Casuarina, the former Versace mansion on Ocean Drive, was not simply a wedding venue. It was a declaration. Rovman had grown up in Aventura, in a comfortable but quietly insecure household, and for as long as I had known him, he had been obsessed with the architecture of prestige. Every restaurant he chose, every address he considered, every event he attended, all of it was carefully selected for what it announced about the man he believed he was in the process of becoming. He wanted to be seen arriving somewhere significant, and he had invited me specifically to witness it. I filed the invitation in my top desk drawer, not in the trash, not on display, and opened my laptop to the Henderson project files. There was work to do. There was always work to do, and that relentless grounding truth had carried me through every difficult morning since the one where I collected a cardboard box from a Coral Gables doorstep in silence. But I will tell you what I knew, standing in my studio that morning with the Miami sun beginning to warm the industrial windows and the neighborhood coming alive on the street below. I was going to that wedding. I was not going alone. I did not yet know who would walk through those doors beside me. I did not know that the answer was already moving toward me, quietly, without announcement, the way the most significant things always move before they arrive. I did not know that within 72 hours an email would land in my inbox that would alter the entire trajectory of what came next, or that the man behind it would turn out to be unlike anyone I had ever stood beside, or that the story I was stepping into had nothing to do with Rovman Lewis at its core. It never had. His invitation was simply the door. Everything on the other side of it was already mine. Chapter 2. The Man in the Penthouse. The email arrived on a Thursday morning, and Priya printed it without a word, set it beside my coffee, and returned to her desk, which was her precise and reliable way of telling me that this one required my complete, undivided attention. I picked it up. The inquiry was for a full interior redesign of the private residence floors at the Surf Club Four Seasons in Surfside. 6 floors of executive suites and private living spaces inside one of the most architecturally distinguished hotel properties on Miami's upper coastline. The Surf Club had a history that predated most of Miami's modern ambitions, founded in the 1930s, restored with extraordinary care, carrying in its bones the quiet authority of a place that had never needed to compete for relevance because it had simply always mattered. The budget in the inquiry was a number I read 3 times. I set the paper down, looked out my studio window, picked it up and read it again. This was not a residential client upgrading a kitchen. This was the largest single commission I had ever been seriously considered for, and the inquiry was written not in the breathless language of someone shopping for options, but in the measured, specific language of someone who had already done their research and was extending a professional courtesy by making contact. I replied within the hour, professionally, calmly, with absolutely no indication of what was happening in my chest. The meeting was confirmed for the following Monday. I arrived at the Surf Club in Surfside at 9 in the morning in the kind of composed, precise state of readiness that I had trained myself into over years of walking into rooms where I was the only person who looked like me. I wore a structured cream blazer, carried a leather portfolio, and had prepared a preliminary concept document that demonstrated I had studied the property's architectural history before setting foot inside it. I expected to be met by a hotel vice president, or perhaps a facilities director, or some category of corporate manager with a committee behind him and a standardized approval process. I was escorted directly to the penthouse floor. The elevator opened into a wide, light-flooded corridor with unfinished walls and temporary construction lighting still strung along the ceiling from recent renovation work. At the far end, standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows with his back to me, looking south toward Bal Harbor and the long curve of coastline beyond it, was a man I had not been told to expect. He was tall, broad-shouldered in the understated way of a man who does not frequent gyms for the purpose of being seen in them. He wore dark trousers and a simple white shirt, with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, no jacket, no tie, no watch that announced itself. When he turned at the sound of the elevator, his face was composed and unhurried, the particular expression of a man who has never once entered a room needing it to receive him in a specific way. "Ms. Love," he said, not a question, a confirmation. "Mr. King." His name was Brandon King, and in the 48 hours between the confirmation of this meeting and my arrival, I had learned what any thorough professional would learn about a prospective client of this scale. His father, Elmore King, had arrived in Miami from Kingston, Jamaica in 1971 with an engineering qualification and a ferocious appetite for work. In 1983, with 2 partners and a loan that most banks had refused to extend, Elmore founded a port logistics company operating out of a single leased warehouse near Port Miami. By the time Brandon was finishing his MBA, that company had contracts with 6 international shipping lines and a workforce of over 200 people. Brandon had not inherited an empire. He had expanded one, methodically, intelligently, diversifying first into commercial real estate along the Brickell Corridor, then into infrastructure investment across South Florida, then into a portfolio of holdings that was significant enough that his name appeared in financial publications without him ever having solicited the attention. He did not give interviews. He did not appear at charity galas for the photographs. The only visible markers of his world were the quality of his stillness and the specific gravity of the spaces he occupied. I noticed all of this in approximately 90 seconds, filed it professionally, and opened my portfolio. We spent the first 20 minutes in the efficient, technical language of a client briefing, square footage, structural considerations, the hotel's historical aesthetic commitments, the specific needs of long-term residence guests versus short-term executive visitors. Brandon asked precise questions. He listened to my answers completely, without interrupting, without glancing at his phone, without performing attention in the way that people perform attention when they are actually composing their next statement. He was simply, genuinely present. It was more disarming than anything theatrical would have been. At the end of the walkthrough, standing at the window with Surfside laid out below us and the Atlantic enormous and blue beyond it, he turned to me and asked a question that had nothing to do with square footage or tile selections or construction timelines. What does this space need that it doesn't know it's missing? I did not hesitate. I did not consult my notes. I told him exactly what I saw. A building of genuine historical dignity that was being renovated in a language slightly too contemporary for its own bones, that needed warmth reintroduced not through decoration, but through material honesty, that was trying to be impressive when it should simply be allowing itself to be remembered. Brandon was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled, not the managed professional smile of a man conducting a business meeting, but something quieter and more genuine than that. The smile of a person who has just heard something true stated plainly and finds it unexpectedly satisfying. "I'll have my office confirm the second meeting before end of day," he said. I thanked him, gathered my portfolio, and rode the elevator down alone. Standing in the surf club lobby with the Atlantic light coming through the tall windows and the history of the place settling quietly around me, I allowed myself exactly 10 seconds of something that was not quite excitement and not quite relief, but lived in the productive territory between the two. Then I walked to my car, pulled out my phone, and called Priya to tell her to prepare the full concept proposal. There was serious work ahead. I intended to be ready for every inch of it. Chapter 3. Coconut Grove and Honesty. The second meeting was not what I had prepared for, and I'm still not entirely certain whether that was accidental. Brandon's office had confirmed Monday at 10 a design presentation at his corporate offices near Brickell City Centre, formal and structured, the kind of meeting I had prepared a 40-page concept document for over the course of a weekend that I had not left my studio for. I had colour palettes, material samples organised by floor, historical reference images drawn from the surf club's original 1930s architectural records, and a cost framework precise enough to demonstrate that I understood both the aesthetic ambition and the financial discipline required at this scale. I was ready. Then, at 8:15 on Monday morning, a message arrived from Brandon's executive assistant. "Mr. King has suggested moving the presentation to dinner this evening, if that works for your schedule. Green Street Cafe, Coconut Grove, 7 o'clock. He apologizes for the short notice." I read the message twice. In my professional experience, clients who reroute formal presentations to dinner at short notice fall into two categories: those who are not serious and those who are so entirely serious that the formality of a conference room feels inadequate to what they are actually trying to assess. Everything I had observed about Brandon King in our first meeting placed him firmly in the second category. I confirmed. I reorganized my portfolio into something more conversational than presentational, and at 7 o'clock I walked into Green Street Cafe on Main Highway in Coconut Grove, a place I had loved for years, with its wide outdoor terrace and the generous old trees overhead and the particular relaxed intelligence of a neighborhood that has always known exactly what it is. And found Brandon already seated at a corner table with still water and no phone visible on the surface. He stood when I arrived. That detail, small and old-fashioned, registered without my permission. We spent the first 30 minutes in genuine professional territory. I walked him through the concept document. He engaged with it seriously, asked specific questions about material sourcing and lead times, challenged one of my structural assumptions about the third-floor corridor in a way that demonstrated he had been thinking carefully about the space since our first meeting. It was a good 30 minutes, the kind that reminds you why you do the work you do. Then the food arrived, and something in the dynamic shifted. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, simply the way the temperature of a room shifts when a window is opened somewhere. He asked me how long I had been in Miami. I told him I was born here. Liberty City. That I had left briefly for school and returned before the city had a chance to stop feeling like mine. Something in his expression changed. A recognition, perhaps, or a particular quality of attention that is different from polite interest. He told me his father had come to Miami with nothing and built everything on the understanding that this city rewards the people who are willing to see it clearly, rather than simply use it as a backdrop for their ambitions. That he had grown up watching Elmore King negotiate contracts on a Port Miami dock in a suit that didn't fit yet, because a tailor was still a future tense luxury. He told me once, Brandon said, that the most dangerous thing a man can do is mistake the appearance of arrival for actual arrival. I understood that completely and told him so. He asked about my firm, not its client list or its revenue, but how I had built it, what the first year had actually felt like, what I had underestimated. I told him about the 4 months of runway, the second-hand laptop, the particular specific terror of the first month when the phone did not ring, and I had to sit with the possibility that I had miscalculated everything. I did not mention Rovman, but I talked about starting over, about the specific loneliness of rebuilding something in a city that moves without waiting, about learning to trust the work when the external evidence was not yet cooperating. Brandon listened in a way that is genuinely rare. Not the listening of a man waiting for his turn to speak, and not the performed listening of someone constructing the impression of depth. He simply received what I said, and let it sit between us without rushing past it. His own marriage had ended 3 years ago, he told me. A woman who had loved the architecture of his life more than the reality of it, who had wanted the version of Brandon King that appeared in financial publications and found the actual man somewhat less cinematic. The divorce had been quiet and mutual and honest, which he said was the only mercy in it. I think we were both relieved, he said, which is its own particular sadness. I recognized that feeling with a precision I did not comment on. We left the restaurant at 9:30, later than I had anticipated, the terrace having emptied gradually around us, while we were not paying attention to it. He walked with me to the corner of Main Highway and Grand Avenue, and we stood there for a moment in the warm Coconut Grove evening, the old neighborhood breathing quietly around us, the lights of the restaurants, and the sound of the street settling into the specific register of a Miami night that is not trying to be anything other than itself. The concept document is strong, he said, more than strong. I'll have the revised material specifications to your office by Wednesday, I told him. He nodded. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, not loaded with anything performed, simply the natural space that opens between two people who have said more than they planned to and are both quietly acknowledging it. Wednesday, he confirmed. I drove home along South Bayshore Drive with the windows down, the bay dark and enormous to my right, the banyan trees making a cathedral of the road overhead. The night air moved through the car, and I let myself feel, without examination or qualification, that something had shifted in the landscape of my life. I was not certain yet what it was, but I was paying attention. Chapter 4. The Confession. The thing about best friends is that they see through every version of the story you have rehearsed before you open your mouth. I called Diane on Friday evening, intending to mention the invitation casually, just something that had happened, something I was handling with complete composure, something that required no particular discussion. By the time I finished talking, 45 minutes had passed, my coffee had gone cold, and Diane had not interrupted me once. That was how I knew she was preparing something I was not going to enjoy hearing. "Come to Panther," she said. "Saturday morning, 9 o'clock. I arrived at Panther Coffee on Northwest 2nd Avenue at 5 minutes to 9 and found Diane already at a corner table outside, 2 cortados ordered, her reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead in the way she wore them when she intended to pay serious attention to something. Diane had been my closest friend for 11 years. We had met during my second year working in Coral Gables, 2 young black women navigating the particular social architecture of industries that had not historically made space for us, and we had built the kind of friendship that does not require maintenance because it is constructed from something more durable than convenience. She looked at me the way she always looked at me when she had already formed a complete opinion and was deciding how directly to deliver it. "Tell me everything," she said, "from the beginning. Leave nothing out." So I did. I told her about the envelope, about the note card and Rovman's handwriting and the specific calculation embedded in those 11 words. I told her about the venue, Villa Casa Casuarina, and what that choice communicated about the image he was constructing. I told her about my decision to go and about clearing my calendar for that Saturday without hesitation. Then I told her about Brandon. I told her about the surf club inquiry and the rerouted dinner and the terrace at Green Street Cafe and the 2 hours that had passed without either of us noticing the time moving. I told her what he said about his father on the Port Miami dock and what I said about the 4 months of runway and the second-hand laptop and how he had listened in that particular way of his that felt less like politeness and more like genuine hunger for the truth of a thing. I told her about driving home along South Bayshore Drive, with the windows down and something unfamiliar and inconvenient stirring in my chest. Diane listened to all of it. She picked up her cortado. She set it down without drinking from it. "Kerry," she said, "don't. Kerry, I know what you're going to say. Then save me the breath and tell me I'm right." I looked out at Northwest 2nd Avenue, the morning foot traffic moving past the coffee shop, the windward murals bright in the early October sun, a delivery cyclist threading through the intersection with the particular Miami confidence of someone who has made peace with the chaos of this city's streets. "You're going to tell me that going to that wedding is walking directly into Rovman's design," I said. "Yes. And that bringing a man I have known for 3 weeks is reckless and potentially humiliating. Also, yes. And that I am halfway towards something I have not given myself permission to fully acknowledge yet." Diane was quiet for a moment. "I was going to say you're already more than halfway," she said, "but close enough." I wrapped both hands around my cortado and said nothing for a while. The street moved around us. A couple walked past with a dog that was badly behaved and deeply loved. Somewhere down the block, music drifted from a studio door that someone had left open, something slow and unhurried, exactly wrong for the speed of the conversation I was having with myself. The honest truth, the truth I had been orbiting all week without landing on it directly, was that Diane was right about both things simultaneously, and those 2 truths were not in conflict with each other the way I wanted them to be. Going to that wedding was a risk. Not because I was afraid of Rovman. That particular fear had evaporated somewhere in the 18 months of building a life that had nothing to do with him. The risk was subtler than that. The risk was that I was about to walk into a space that Rovman had architected specifically to diminish me, and that any misstep, anything that looked like effort or performance or a woman trying too hard to prove something, would hand him exactly the narrative he had designed the event to produce. And Brandon. Brandon was a different kind of risk entirely. He asked if I wanted company. I told Diane, not, "I'll escort you," not, "Let me handle this," just, "Would you like company?" And you said yes. I said yes. Diane looked at me with the particular expression she reserved for moments when she believed I already possessed the answer to the question I was asking her. "Then you've already decided," she said. "Both things. You decided about the wedding the morning the envelope arrived, and you decided about him somewhere on South Bayshore Drive on a Monday night. You're not here asking me what to do, Carrie. You're here asking me to confirm that you're not losing your mind." "Am I losing my mind?" "No," she said. "But you are doing that thing you do where you stand very still and very composed on the outside, while something enormous is happening on the inside, and you wait to see if it survives the waiting before you acknowledge it." That was accurate enough that I did not argue with it. What I did not tell Diane, what I had not yet told anyone, including myself in full and honest terms, was that something had happened at the surf club the previous Wednesday, during the material review meeting that had shifted the precise geography of whatever this was. We had been standing on the fourth floor, east corridor, debating a limestone option against a reclaimed oak for the hallway walls. It was a technical conversation, specific and detailed, the kind I am most comfortable inside because the parameters are clear. Brandon had his jacket off. He had been on site since early morning dealing with a construction logistics issue, and there was a quality of easy, unguarded presence about him that was different from the composed stillness of our earlier meetings. He had turned to point at a section of the wall, and his arm had briefly brushed mine. Entirely incidental, entirely unremarkable in any objective sense, and something in my nervous system had registered it with a precision that was disproportionate to the event. I had said nothing. I had continued discussing limestone, but I had noticed, and I was fairly certain from the slight pause in his sentence that he had noticed that I noticed. I kept this detail to myself. That evening, I received a text from Brandon's personal number, not his assistant's, his own, asking if I had a few minutes for a call about the third-floor layout. I said yes. The call lasted 20 minutes and covered the layout thoroughly in the first 8. The remaining 12 were something else, looser and quieter, a conversation about a book he was reading and a building in Little Havana that I had mentioned in passing 2 meetings ago, and that he had apparently gone to look at on his own time because he was curious about my reference. He had driven to Little Havana to look at a building I had mentioned once in passing. I sat with that fact for a long time after we hung up. Diane had finished her cortado and was watching me with the patience of a woman who had 11 years of practice at waiting for me to surface from my own interior. "He's going to that wedding with me," I said. "I know. And whatever else is happening, I'm not going to rush it or manage it or try to make it into something I can file in a category I already understand." "That," Diane said, "is possibly the most mature thing you have ever said to me." "Don't get used to it." She laughed, the full, unconstrained laugh that I had loved since the first year I knew her, and signaled for 2 more cortados. We sat at that corner table on Northwest 2nd Avenue for another hour, talking about other things. Her work, a renovation project in Edgewater I was considering bidding on. The new restaurant that had opened 2 blocks south that neither of us had tried yet. The conversation found its way back to ordinary ground the way conversations do after they have covered the necessary difficult terrain. But as I drove back to my studio afterward, the October sun turning the windward streets into something bright and almost unreasonably beautiful, I was thinking about what Diane had said, that I had already decided, both things, and the deeper I looked at that statement, the more I understood it was not a warning. It was simply a fact. I had decided. Perhaps on South Bayshore Drive, with the windows down, perhaps earlier than that, perhaps in the penthouse corridor of the surf club, when a man with nothing to prove turned from a window and confirmed my name as though he had been expecting someone worth expecting. I did not know yet what that meant or where it led, but I had learned, in the years since a cardboard box on a Coral Gables doorstep had rearranged everything I thought I was building, that the most important decisions do not always announce themselves with clarity and fanfare. Sometimes they arrive the way Brandon King arrived in that corridor, quietly, without performance, already certain. Chapter 5. Preparation and Danger. Nobody tells you that moving forward feels at first almost indistinguishable from falling. The 4 weeks between that Saturday morning at Panther Coffee and the weekend of Rovman's wedding were the strangest weeks I had experienced in a long time, not because they were painful, but because they contained two entirely different stories running simultaneously, and I was the only person who could see both of them clearly. The first story was professional and structured and deeply satisfying. The Surf Club Four Seasons project had expanded beyond the initial scope. Brandon had approved the full concept document with minimal revisions, added 2 additional floors to the redesign brief, and introduced me to the hotel's construction management team in a meeting that communicated, without anything being stated explicitly, that my position on this project was not provisional. I was spending 3 days a week on site in Surfside, working alongside architects and contractors in the particular organized chaos of a significant renovation, and the work was the best I had ever done. I could feel it, that specific creative confidence that arrives when a project is large enough to demand everything you have, and you discover, with some surprise, that everything you have is actually enough. The second story had no formal structure and refused to be organized into a concept document. It had begun, I think, on the Sunday, when Brandon called me from Coconut Grove Marina at 7 in the morning and asked, with the directness that I was learning was simply the register in which he communicated, whether I had plans for the afternoon. I did not. "Sailing," he said. "Nothing formal. I go most Sundays when I'm in the city. You're welcome to come." I arrived at the marina at noon with my portfolio, not because I planned to work, but because carrying it was a habit, and habits are the scaffolding we build around the things we are not yet ready to simply do without excuse. I did not open the portfolio once. We sailed south along the coastline with the Miami skyline retreating slowly behind us until it was reduced to a thin, glittering line on the horizon, and the water was wide and deeply blue in every direction, and the only sounds were the wind and the rigging and the occasional cry of something overhead that did not concern itself with any of our complications. Brandon handled the boat with the quiet competence of a man who has done something long enough that it has become physical memory rather than conscious effort. He did not perform seamanship. He simply sailed. I sat on the bow with my face in the wind and felt for the first time in longer than I could precisely calculate that I was not managing anything. We did not talk much on the water. That surprised me. I had expected conversation to fill the space, the way it had filled the terrace at Green Street Cafe and the corridors of the surf club and the 20-minute phone call that became 32. But Brandon had a quality of comfortable silence that I had rarely encountered in another person, a capacity to be present without requiring the presence to be annotated, and I found myself falling into it without resistance. On the drive back, he stopped at Versailles restaurant on Calle Ocho without asking, pulled into the parking lot, went inside, and returned 7 minutes later with 2 Cuban coffees and a paper bag of pastelitos that he set on the center console between us without ceremony. "You mentioned it," he said simply, when I looked at him. I had mentioned Versailles once, in passing. 3 weeks earlier, during the Green Street dinner, in a sentence about the places in Miami that had always felt like true landmarks to me rather than tourist constructions. One sentence. He had stored it with the same quiet precision with which he approached every other thing that apparently mattered to him. I looked out the passenger window at Calle Ocho, moving past, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not have been either too much or too small. Over those 4 weeks, I learned things about him that no publication had ever printed. He read physical books, history and biography primarily, though he had an unexpected affection for certain novels that he described as books that understand silence. He kept a chessboard in his office at Brickell city centre and played against himself when he needed to think through a problem, moving pieces for both sides with the dispassionate focus of a man comfortable occupying multiple perspectives simultaneously. He called his mother Gloria King every Sunday from wherever in the world he happened to be, London, Houston, Nassau, without exception, and the calls lasted no less than 45 minutes. He learned things about me in return, though I gave them more reluctantly and in smaller portions, that I sing badly and at full volume in my car and have no intention of addressing this. That I grew up in Liberty City, attending a church whose choir director told me at age 12 that I had passion, but not pitch, which I have always considered an acceptable trade. That I have a habit of photographing interesting doors in every city I visit, the specific shape and color and age of an entrance, telling you more about the life behind it than any interior ever could. That I was afraid. I did not tell him that last one directly, but I think he understood it, the way perceptive people understand the things that are being carefully omitted from a conversation. And then, in the third week, the second story began to develop complications. A mutual contact, a woman named Cecile, who ran in overlapping social circles with both Rovman and me through the Miami design and real estate community, texted me on a Wednesday evening. The message was careful and friendly in the particular way of messages that contain information the sender is uncertain whether to deliver. Kerry, heard you're doing really well. Big project in Surfside? People are talking? Wanted you to know. I thanked her, read the message twice, understood its actual content clearly. Someone had seen me at the surf club. Someone had connected the project to my firm and the firm to me and had mentioned it at a dinner or a cocktail reception or one of the dozen social events that circulate through Miami's professional community on any given week. And that information had traveled, as information always travels in this city, until it arrived at a table where Rovman Lewis was seated. I knew this because 3 days later, Priya told me that someone had called the studio asking about our current projects and hung up when she asked for a name. Rovman had spent 18 months constructing a mental image of me that served a specific narrative purpose for him. That image was now being dismantled by reality, and he could feel it happening from a distance without being able to see it clearly, which is always more unsettling than a visible threat. What I did not fully anticipate was Sloane. I learned about her involvement indirectly, through Cecile again, and then through a separate source, a contractor I knew who moved through some of the same Palm Beach social circles that Sloane's family occupied. Sloane had begun asking questions, not about the surf club project, about me specifically, about who I was, what I looked like, how long Rovman and I had been together, why it had ended. She was asking the questions that a woman asks when she has looked at her fiancé's face at the wrong moment and found something there that he had not offered voluntarily. I sat with that information for a full evening in my Brickell apartment and felt something I had not expected to feel. Not satisfaction and not guilt, but a quiet, unearned sorrow for a woman I had never met who was 3 weeks from a wedding and apparently already beginning to understand something important about the man standing at the other end of the aisle. I did not cause that. Rovman caused that years before he sent me an envelope with a note card designed to wound, but I felt it nonetheless. The following Tuesday, during a late site visit at the surf club, Brandon found me on the 5th floor, standing at the window long after I should have left for the evening. The construction crew had gone. The floor was quiet. I was watching the Atlantic in the late light, doing what it always does, moving without apology, indifferent to the complications of the people watching it from windows. "You're still here," he said. "So are you." He came to stand beside me at the window, not close enough to be anything other than a man standing beside a colleague at the end of a long day. but present, fully and without performance present. "Something is on your mind," he said. It was not a question. "Rovman's fiancée has been asking about me," I told him, "which means he's unsettled, which means whatever he built this wedding invitation around is not going the way he planned." Brandon was quiet for a moment. "Does that change anything for you?" I thought about it honestly. "No," I said, "but I feel something for her that I didn't expect to feel." He nodded slowly. He did not rush past that with reassurance or redirect it with logic. He let it be the true and complicated thing it was. "That says something about you," he said finally. "It says I'm inconveniently empathetic." "Yes," he said, "among other things." We stood at that window for another few minutes while the Atlantic did its ancient, indifferent work below us. Then we rode the elevator down together and walked out into the surfside evening and went our separate ways. But I thought about those 3 words the entire drive home, among other things. I was still thinking about them when I fell asleep. Chapter 6. The Wedding Eve Fracture. There is a particular kind of silence that arrives the night before something irreversible. It is not peaceful. It is not anxious in any simple way. It sits in the room with you like a third presence, patient, observant, entirely unwilling to be hurried, and it demands that you look honestly at whatever you have been managing rather than examining. That was the silence that filled my Brickell apartment on the Friday evening before Rovman's wedding. I had done everything right. I had confirmed with Brandon. I had chosen my dress, a deep burgundy that I had owned for 2 years and worn once, structured at the shoulder, fluid at the hem, the kind of garment that does not ask for attention but does not apologize for receiving it. I had arranged for Priya to handle a Saturday morning client call. I had eaten a proper dinner and poured a single glass of wine and sat on my balcony overlooking Biscayne Bay in the warm October evening with every practical matter resolved and accounted for. And then the silence arrived and sat down beside me. I want to be precise about what I was feeling, because imprecision would be a disservice to what that evening actually was. I was not afraid of Rovman. That particular fear, the fear of his assessment, his approval, the fear of being found inadequate by a man whose judgment I had once mistakenly elevated above my own, had burned away somewhere in the 18 months since a cardboard box on a Coral Gables doorstep had reorganized my understanding of what I actually needed from another person. He no longer held any architecture in my interior life. That was simply true. What I was feeling was something more difficult to name, and in its own way, more significant. I was grieving. Not Rovman. I want to be absolutely clear about that. What I was grieving, sitting on that balcony with Biscayne Bay spread out below me in the dark and the lights of Miami Beach shimmering across the water, was the version of myself that had spent 18 months waiting, without consciously admitting the waiting, for something from him. Not a reconciliation, not an apology even. Something more fundamental than either of those things. Some acknowledgement that what we had built together had been real, that its ending had cost something, that the woman he had left on the functional side of a text message had mattered in a way that deserved more than 11 minutes and a cardboard box. That acknowledgement was never coming. I had understood this intellectually for a long time. But there is a significant distance between understanding something with your mind and releasing it with the rest of yourself. And sitting on that balcony, I felt the distance between those two things with a clarity that was almost physical. Tomorrow, I would walk into Villa Casa Casuarina, and the last chapter of a story I had not written and did not choose would close permanently. And after it closed, there would be no more reason to wait for anything from Rovman Lewis, no more open edges, no more unfinished emotional architecture holding space in my interior life for something that had already demonstrated it was never going to arrive. There was freedom in that. I could see it clearly. But freedom of that particular kind arrives carrying its own weight, and I was honest enough with myself that evening to sit with the weight before reaching for the freedom. I called Brandon at 9:30. I did not plan to. I picked up my phone intending to call Diane, and found myself dialing his number instead, and did not examine the distinction too carefully. He answered on the second ring. Kerry. Just my name, the way he always said it, not as a greeting exactly, more as a confirmation, as though my calling was a thing he had been expecting would happen eventually, and was neither surprised nor displeased that it had. I'm sitting on my balcony, I told him, looking at the bay. And I almost called to cancel tomorrow. A pause. Not the pause of a man calculating his response, but the pause of a man who is actually thinking, who takes the truth you have just offered him seriously enough to sit with it for a moment before answering. Almost, he said. Almost. What stopped you? I looked out at Biscayne Bay, at the dark water and the moving lights of a late boat somewhere in the middle distance, and the enormous glittering patience of a body of water that has been absorbing Miami's complicated history for longer than any of us have been here to observe it. I realized I was about to let his design win by a different method, I said. I was going to remove myself from the situation and call it composure, but it wasn't composure. It was avoidance wearing composure's clothing. Brandon was quiet for a moment. Are you home? I asked. I can be at your building in 40 minutes, he said. He was there in 35. I met him in the lobby and we rode the elevator up without discussing it, and I made coffee that neither of us particularly needed, and we sat on my balcony with Biscayne Bay, doing its quiet, enormous work below us and the October night warm and salt-scented around us. He did not arrive with advice. He did not arrive with reassurance or with the particular brand of performed confidence that men sometimes offer women in vulnerable moments as a substitute for actual presence. He simply arrived and sat beside me in the specific, grounded way that I had come to understand was simply who he was, a man who showed up completely or did not position himself as having shown up at all. We talked for a long time. He told me about the week before his divorce was finalized, how he had driven alone to the Rickenbacker Causeway at midnight and sat in his car looking at the water and conducted an honest inventory of every decision he had made in the preceding 7 years. Not to assign blame, not to construct a narrative of his own victimhood, simply to understand clearly what had happened so that he could carry it accurately rather than conveniently. The stories we tell ourselves about our own losses are the most dangerous fictions we ever produce, he said, because we believe them completely. I thought about the story I had been telling myself about Rovman, the version in which I was simply a woman who had moved forward cleanly and without complication, who had converted grief into productivity with perfect efficiency, who had built her studio and rebuilt her life, and required nothing further from the past she had left behind. It was not a dishonest story, but it was incomplete. What's the complete version? Brandon asked, when I said this aloud. I looked at him. That I am still, on some level, waiting to feel like it wasn't my fault, I said. That I am still carrying, somewhere under all the work and the competence and the forward motion, the question of whether he was right about me, whether I was too much, whether ambitious means the same thing as unlovable. The words landed in the warm October air between us, and I did not reach back to retrieve them. Brandon looked at me for a long moment with the direct, unhurried quality of attention that I had first encountered in a Surfside penthouse corridor and had never quite become accustomed to. "Kerry," he said, "don't say something beautiful that I'll have to fact-check later." The corner of his mouth moved. "I was going to say," he said, "that the woman who gave me that answer just now is the same woman who walked into my building 3 weeks ago with a 40-page concept document and told me what a space needed that it didn't know it was missing. And she was not too much. She was exactly sufficient for the work and for everything else. I looked out at the bay. I breathed. "I'm going tomorrow," I said. "I know." As myself, not as a response to him, not as a performance, as the person I actually am, walking into a room with a man I stopped. Brandon did not finish the sentence for me. He simply waited, the way he always waited, patient and present and entirely without agenda. "As the person I actually am," I finished, choosing the version of the sentence I was ready to complete. He nodded. We stayed on that balcony until well past midnight, the bay moving below us in the dark, the lights of Miami Beach scattered across the water like a second sky. At some point, the conversation became quieter and less directed, not the silence of two people who have run out of things to say, but the silence of two people who have said the necessary things and are resting inside that accomplishment. When he left, he stopped at the door and turned back. "Wear the burgundy," he said. "How do you know I have a burgundy dress?" "I don't," he said, "but you seem like a woman who does." I closed the door behind him and stood in my hallway for a moment, in the particular quality of stillness that follows a visit from a person whose presence rearranges the atmosphere of a room. Then I went to my closet. The burgundy dress was hanging exactly where I had left it. I was ready. Chapter 7. The arrival. There is a moment when you have spent weeks preparing for something, when preparation ends and the thing itself simply begins. No rehearsal, no revision, no opportunity to refine the concept document or reconsider the material selections. Just the moment, arriving exactly as moments always arrive, indifferent to whether you are ready, moving at its own pace, asking nothing of you except your full and honest presence inside it. That moment arrived for me when Brandon's car turned onto Ocean Drive and Villa Casa Casuarina came into view. I had driven Ocean Drive hundreds of times in my life. I had walked its length in every season and every mood that Miami produces. In the thick, breathless heat of August, in the crystalline perfection of January, in the particular electric atmosphere of a Friday night, when the street belongs entirely to itself, and everyone on it understands implicitly that something is being celebrated without anyone announcing what it is. I knew this street the way you know a street that has been part of your city's identity for your entire life. But seeing it now, through the passenger window, with the former Versace mansion lit from within, and the valets in white jackets, and the line of guests moving through the arched entrance in their finest clothing, I felt something I had not anticipated feeling. I felt completely calm. Not the managed calm of a woman who has talked herself into steadiness from a position of internal turbulence. Actual calm, the deep, grounded variety that lives below the level of performance and requires no maintenance. I had sat on my balcony the previous night and done the necessary work of feeling everything that needed to be felt, and Brandon had sat beside me while I did it, and something in that combination had cleared the atmosphere entirely. I was simply here, present, myself, ready. Brandon found parking 2 blocks south on Ocean Drive, and we walked back along the sidewalk in the warm evening, the Atlantic invisible but present beyond the hotels on our right, the Art Deco facades of South Beach lit in their particular pastel glory on our left, the specific magnificent noise of Miami on a Saturday evening rising around us like something orchestrated. He was wearing a dark suit, not black, something richer and more considered than black, a deep charcoal with a faint texture that caught the light as he moved. No tie, an open collar. The watch on his wrist was simple and old, the kind that has been worn rather than displayed. He walked beside me with the unhurried, grounded quality that I had come to understand was not composure practiced, but composure inhabited. The bearing of a man who has been comfortable in his own skin for long enough that it no longer requires any conscious tending. "How are you feeling?" he asked as we approached the entrance. "Like myself," I said, "which is the right answer." He looked at me with that quiet, direct attention. Then he nodded once, the small, certain nod of a man who considers that the complete and sufficient answer and has no need to elaborate upon it. We walked through the arched entrance of Villa Casa Casuarina and into the mosaic courtyard. The space was magnificent. I say that without qualification and without the complicated feelings one might expect me to attach to a compliment directed at the venue of Rovman Lewis's wedding. The Versace mansion was simply, objectively, one of the most extraordinary private event spaces in Miami. The famous mosaic pool at its center, catching the late golden light and returning it in fragments of color, the Mediterranean architecture rising around the courtyard, with the particular authority of a building that has housed remarkable human drama for decades and absorbed all of it without alteration. The flowers were extraordinary. The lighting was considered. Someone with genuine aesthetic intelligence had been involved in the evening's design, and the professional part of my mind registered and respected that, independent of every other feeling in the room. The gathering was substantial. 120 guests, perhaps closer to 140, distributed through the courtyard and the loggia and the upper terrace in the natural self-organizing way of people who understand how to inhabit a beautiful space without being overwhelmed by it. I saw Rovman before he saw me. He was standing near the far end of the courtyard with his best man and two other men I did not recognize, holding a champagne flute with the slightly elevated posture of a man who is aware that this is his evening and is making certain his body communicates that awareness. He was animated, talking with the particular expressive confidence of someone who is performing ease rather than experiencing it. His cream linen suit was excellent. He looked, from this distance, exactly like a man who had arranged a magnificent occasion and intended to occupy the center of it fully. Then his eyes traveled across the courtyard and found me. I watched it happen with the detached precision of a person observing a weather system from a safe distance. The animation in his face did not disappear. It was too public a moment for that, and Rovman had always been skilled at managing his surface in company. But it altered, subtly, swiftly, in a way that only someone who had spent 4 years learning the specific vocabulary of his expressions would have been able to read. The calculation that moved behind his eyes in the 2 seconds before he recomposed himself was visible to me as clearly as text on a page. He had expected absence. He had built this invitation around absence, around the image of Kerry Love, diminished and solitary, standing at the periphery of someone else's happiness with nothing of her own to show for the 18 months since he had walked away. He had imagined this moment, I realized, with some frequency, had returned to it as a form of private reassurance, had let it sit in his interior life as quiet confirmation that his decision had been correct, and his life had flourished in the direction it was meant to flourish. What he saw instead was a woman in deep burgundy, standing in the entrance of his wedding venue, with her chin level and her posture easy and her expression carrying none of the things he had spent 18 months imagining he would find there. And beside her, a man he recognized. I saw that recognition travel across Rovman's face, a beat after the first, the slight recalibration of a man who has just identified someone in a context he did not anticipate and is rapidly assembling the implications. He knew Brandon King's name, possibly knew the company, possibly knew enough of the broader Miami professional landscape to understand what that name represented in rooms like this one. His best man noticed the shift, said something. Rovman returned his attention to the conversation with the practiced smoothness of a man who has been managing his surface in public for a long time. Brandon, beside me, greeted a man approaching from the left. The developer I had learned was connected to the Miami World Center project, with the specific warmth of genuine acquaintance rather than performed networking. They spoke briefly, laughed at something, parted. Brandon moved easily through the gathering, and I moved with him, And the effect was not of two people making an entrance, but of two people arriving somewhere they belong, which is an entirely different thing and produces an entirely different impression. At the top of the stone staircase leading to the upper loggia, I saw Sloane. She was standing with her maid of honor and two women I took to be her sisters, still in the first hour of her wedding reception, in a gown that was genuinely beautiful. Ivory silk, with a structured bodice and a long, clean line that suited her slender frame with the kind of effortlessness that suggests either an excellent designer or a woman with a naturally authoritative relationship with clothing. She was laughing at something when I first looked at her. Then the laugh shifted as her gaze followed the direction her maid of honor had quietly indicated. She looked at me with the clear, direct assessment of a woman taking a precise and honest measurement. Then she looked at her husband across the courtyard. She saw what was written on his face. Her own expression settled into something I recognized, not because I had seen it on her before, but because I had worn a version of it myself. It was the expression of a woman receiving information she had been trying not to ask for directly, and finding that it has arrived anyway, in the most public and irreversible possible setting. I did not manufacture anything in response to that, not satisfaction, not triumph. What I felt was the complicated, unbidden compassion of a woman who understood exactly what that moment cost. Brandon appeared at my side with 2 glasses of champagne. He handed me one with the quiet ease of a man performing no transaction, simply sharing an evening. "Ready?" he said quietly. I looked around the courtyard, at the extraordinary mosaic tiles and the magnificent flowers and the assembled world of a man who had sent me an envelope designed to wound me and had accidentally delivered me, instead, to the precise coordinates of my own becoming. "I've been ready," I said. We walked into the heart of the gathering, and the evening opened around us like a room that had always known we were coming. Chapter 8. What Gets Said and What Doesn't. I have spent a great deal of my professional life understanding how rooms communicate, not just the colors and the materials and the proportions, though those matter enormously, but the subtler language of a space. The way a ceiling height tells you how important the room believes you are. The way lighting chooses what gets seen and what gets quietly erased. The way the arrangement of furniture determines who holds power before a single word is spoken. Standing in the mosaic courtyard of Villa Casa Casuarina during the cocktail reception, I understood with complete professional clarity what this room was designed to say. It was designed to say, "You have arrived somewhere magnificent, and your arrival here is evidence of who you are." Rovman had chosen well. The former Versace mansion on Ocean Drive was not a venue that required decoration. It simply required witness. The famous mosaic pool caught the late afternoon light and returned it in fragments of gold and turquoise. The courtyard walls rose around us in Mediterranean terracotta and wrought iron, carrying in their bones the particular authority of a place that has absorbed extraordinary human drama for decades and remained entirely unmoved by all of it. Waitstaff moved through the gathered crowd with champagne flutes on silver trays. The flower arrangements were extraordinary. Someone with genuine taste had been involved in their selection, and for one involuntary moment I found myself wondering whether that someone was Sloane, and whether Sloane was, underneath the complications of this day, a woman I might have liked under different circumstances. The crowd itself was precisely what I had anticipated. Rovman's colleagues from his downtown Miami finance firm, men in summer suits carrying the particular social confidence of people for whom rooms like this represent confirmation rather than arrival. His family from Aventura, clustered near the far archway with the slightly formal body language of people who are trying to look as though this level of occasion is entirely familiar to them. Sloane's contingent from Palm Beach, older money, quieter clothing, The kind of people who have been in magnificent rooms long enough to have stopped noticing the magnificence. Brandon moved through all of it, the way water moves through a landscape, finding the natural channels, encountering no resistance, leaving everything essentially undisturbed. Within 20 minutes of our arrival, he had exchanged a genuine substantive greeting with the developer behind the Miami World Center project, shared a brief and clearly warm conversation with a woman who sat on the Adrian Arsht Center board, and acknowledged a Port Authority commissioner with the specific familiarity of two men who have sat across a negotiating table from each other on more than one occasion. He did none of this for effect. He did none of it for my benefit. This was simply his life. The natural human geography of a man who had spent 20 years building things in this city and had accumulated, in that building, genuine relationships with the people who shaped it. I watched Rovman watching him. Rovman had recognized Brandon within minutes of our arrival. I could see the moment of recognition cross his face from across the courtyard, that particular expression of a man who has just encountered information he was not prepared for and is rapidly recalculating the implications. He knew the name. He possibly knew the company. He was now standing in his own wedding reception, trying to quietly determine the nature of the connection between Brandon King and the woman he had invited specifically to witness his triumphant arrival. That recalculation was written across his face with a legibility I found almost sympathetic. Almost. He found his moment during the second round of champagne, when Brandon had stepped away briefly to speak with the Port Authority commissioner, and I was standing near the mosaic pool alone, watching the light fracture across the tile in the particular way of late Miami afternoons, when the sun begins its descent and the city turns briefly, magnificently gold. I heard his footsteps before I saw him. I recognized the rhythm of them, that particular deliberate pace that I had once found purposeful and now recognized as performance. "Kerry," he said. I turned with a composure so complete it required no effort, which told me something important about how far I had actually traveled from the woman who had stood in his Coral Gables kitchen 18 months ago. "Rovman," I smiled. Not widely, not warmly, precisely. "Congratulations. The space is extraordinary." He was handsome in the way he had always been handsome, the kind of conventional, well-maintained attractiveness that photographs well and communicates reliability before reliability is demonstrated. He was wearing a cream linen suit that had cost serious money. His smile was calibrated to communicate gracious surprise at my presence, as though he had not spent 6 weeks anticipating this exact moment. "You look well," he said. "I am well." "The design work keeping you busy?" "Very." I let that sit without elaboration, because elaboration would have been a gift, and he did not deserve gifts from me. His eyes moved briefly, involuntarily, to where Brandon was standing across the courtyard. The question he wanted to ask arranged itself visibly behind his expression, and then was visibly suppressed. He was not going to ask. Asking would require acknowledging that the answer mattered to him, and acknowledging that it mattered would dismantle the entire architecture of casual graciousness he had constructed for this approach. "You seem," he began. "Happy," I offered pleasantly. He paused. "I was going to say settled," he said. The word was chosen with care. It contained a suggestion that what I had found was comfort rather than expansion, consolidation rather than growth. It was the last small attempt to reframe the narrative. I looked at him for a moment with the particular quality of attention that you give something you are seeing clearly for the final time. "I am," I said simply. "I genuinely hope today is everything you built it to be, Rovman. I mean that." And the devastating truth, the thing that I could see landing in him with more force than any pointed remark or constructed rebuttal could have delivered, was that I did mean it. Not because I wished him well with any warmth or generosity of spirit, but because I was so thoroughly finished with needing his marriage to fail that his happiness or unhappiness had become genuinely irrelevant to my own. I had no more investment in his narrative. It did not intersect with mine in any direction that mattered. That completeness, that total and authentic absence of need, undid him more efficiently than any confrontation I could have staged. He had no script for a woman who was simply done. "Enjoy the evening," I said, and moved away from the pool toward the archway where Brandon was finishing his conversation. Brandon looked at me when I reached him. One look, direct, quiet, reading the precise temperature of what had just happened with the accuracy of a man who notices things. He handed me a fresh glass of champagne without a word. We moved deeper into the courtyard together, and I felt the specific, clean sensation of a chapter closing. Not with drama or declaration, but with the quiet, irrevocable finality of a door pulled shut from the inside by someone who has chosen, with complete deliberateness, not to look back through the glass. Across the courtyard, Sloane stood at the top of the stone steps in her wedding gown, watching her new husband watch me leave. Her expression was not angry. It was something quieter and more permanent than anger. It was the expression of a woman who has just understood something that will take her a long time to fully examine, standing in the most beautiful and elaborate and expensive setting her wedding budget could produce, on the day that was supposed to be the beginning of everything she had planned. I did not manufacture satisfaction at the sight of it. What I felt was the complicated, unasked-for compassion of a woman who recognized the specific quality of that particular realization. Because I had worn a version of that expression myself, once in a Coral Gables kitchen, before I understood that what looked like an ending was in fact the precise coordinates of my actual beginning. I hoped she would find hers. Brandon touched the small of my back, briefly, lightly, the touch of a man who is not claiming anything, simply indicating presence. And we walked through the arched entrance of Villa Casa Casuarina and out onto the brightness of Ocean Drive. The evening air hit my face, and I breathed it in completely. Behind us, the wedding continued. We did not look back. Chapter 9. The night after. We left before the first dance. Not dramatically, not with any announcement or gesture designed to punctuate our departure. We simply walked out through the arched entrance of Villa Casa Casuarina and onto Ocean Drive, the way people leave when they have somewhere better to be, quietly, without looking back, carrying the particular lightness of two people who have finished with something and are already moving toward what comes next. The evening air on Ocean Drive was warm and salt-edged, the way Miami air is in October when the brutal intensity of summer has finally released its grip, and what remains is something almost merciful. A softness in the atmosphere, a breathability that makes you remember why you chose this city and why you stay. The street was alive in the way it is always alive on a Saturday night. Music from somewhere, voices from everywhere, the slow parade of cars along the boulevard and the distant rhythmic insistence of the Atlantic beyond the hotels on the eastern side. Brandon walked beside me and said nothing for half a block. I was grateful for that. There was a quality to the silence between us that I had come to recognize over the preceding weeks. It was not empty silence, not the uncomfortable silence of two people who have run out of things to say, but the inhabited silence of two people who are both processing something real and trust each other enough to do it without filling every available moment with noise. "Lido," he said finally, when we reached his car. Not a question. "Yes," I said, without asking where that was or what it was or why he had chosen it, because I had learned by then that Brandon King did not make casual suggestions, and that wherever he was proposing we go would be precisely right for what the evening required. He drove us north along the causeway, and then west, and we crossed onto Belle Isle in the dark, with the lights of Miami Beach behind us and the lights of the mainland ahead, and pulled into the parking area of the Standard Hotel, with the water visible on three sides and the night air moving off Biscayne Bay in long, quiet exhalations. Lido Bayside Grill was a low-lit terrace restaurant at the water's edge, the kind of place that understands its primary offering is not the food, but the specific quality of stillness that comes from sitting at the boundary between water and light at the end of a significant day. We were given a corner table. The bay moved darkly beyond the railing. Across the water, the Miami skyline arranged itself in its familiar magnificent excess, all glass and light, and the particular gorgeous arrogance of a city that has never once doubted its own importance. We ordered without much deliberation. The menus were beside the point. For a while we talked about nothing consequential: the food, the water, a boat moving slowly through the darkness at the far edge of our view, leaving a thin white line of wake that dissolved almost immediately into the black. It was the conversation of two people allowing the evening to decompress gradually, not forcing the more significant material to the surface before it was ready to arrive there on its own. Then I said, "I spent the drive here grieving something I did not expect to grieve." Brandon looked at me across the table. "Not him," I said immediately, because precision mattered. "Not Rovman. I want to be absolutely clear about that." "Then what?" I looked out at the bay for a moment, finding the words that were accurate rather than simply available. "The version of myself that kept a door open," I said. "Not for him to return. I never wanted that, not for a single day in the last 18 months. But a door open for some kind of accounting, some acknowledgement that what happened had a cost, and that the cost was real, and that I was the one who bore it while he walked away into the life he had been designing without me. I kept that door open without admitting I was keeping it. And tonight, it closed." Brandon was quiet for a moment. "And the grief is for the door," he said, "not for what was on the other side of it." "Yes," I said. "Exactly that." He nodded slowly. He did not rush past it with reassurance. He did not reframe it into something more comfortable or redirect it toward a more optimistic conclusion. He let it be the true and complicated and fully human thing it was, and sat with me inside it. And that quality of witness, the willingness to simply be present with something difficult without trying to resolve it prematurely, was more comforting than any reassurance could have been. "That version of you kept you company for 18 months, he said finally. "The waiting version, the version that was still expecting something from him. It makes sense that closing the door on her would cost something, even if what you're closing the door on was never going to give you what you needed." I looked at him across the table. "That version of you," he continued, "also built everything you're sitting inside right now. The studio, the surf club contract, the woman who walked into that courtyard tonight and needed nothing from the room in order to be fully present inside it. She came from that same 18 months. I sat with that for a while. The water moved beside us. Somewhere across the bay, a light moved slowly along the shoreline. A late boat, unhurried, carrying itself through the dark with the quiet purposefulness of something that knows its heading and requires no audience. "I was afraid walking into that wedding tonight," I told him, "not of Rovman, not of the room or the people in it, or anything that could have been said to me." "Then what?" I looked at him directly. "Of finally being over him," I said, "because then there was no more reason not to want something new, and wanting something new is—" I stopped. "Terrifying," Brandon said quietly. "Yes." He reached across the table and covered my hand with his. Not a dramatic gesture, nothing theatrical or performed about it. Simply a hand placed over mine with the deliberateness of a man who has decided to do something and does it without requiring the decision to be witnessed or applauded. I looked down at his hand on mine and felt something settle in my chest. Something that had been suspended for a very long time, finally finding its level, the way water finds its level, when the container that has been tilting it finally comes to rest. We stayed at that table until the restaurant was nearly empty and the staff were moving with the polite, patient energy of people who are not going to ask you to leave, but would be grateful if you eventually chose to. We ate well and talked the way people talk when the significant things have already been said, and what remains is the pleasure of the ordinary, his Sunday chess games, my Liberty City church choir, a building in Little Havana we had both been separately thinking about, a conversation about his father and mine that moved through its difficult terrain without either of us flinching from it. At some point, I realized that I was not performing any version of myself. I was not the composed professional or the unbothered woman or the Kerry Love who had walked into that courtyard in deep burgundy with her chin level and her internal architecture perfectly managed. I was simply me, all of it simultaneously, the woman from Liberty City and the studio owner in Wynwood and the person who had collected a cardboard box from a Coral Gables doorstep in silence, and the person sitting at a waterfront table on Belle Isle in the aftermath of a wedding that had turned out to be about something else entirely. Brandon saw all of it. I could feel that he saw it, and I did not feel the need to manage what he was seeing. That, I understood, sitting there was not a small thing. We drove back across the Venetian Causeway well past midnight, the windows down, Miami sprawling on both sides of us in its nighttime extravagance, the water black and enormous and sequined with reflected light, the causeway itself a thin thread connecting the island to the mainland, the sky above us clear and deep in the way of October skies over South Florida, when the humidity has finally relented and the stars are visible again. I watched the city moving past my window and felt, with a completeness that required no analysis and no qualification, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, not because of the man beside me, though he was part of it, not because of what had happened at Villa Casa Casuarina, though that was part of it too, but because I had walked into a room that had been designed to diminish me, and I had walked out of it more fully myself than I had been when I entered, and that transformation, quiet, unannounced, requiring no audience, was entirely and permanently mine. Brandon pulled up in front of my building in Brickell, and we sat for a moment with the engine running and the night air coming through the open windows. "Kerry," he said. "I know," I said. He looked at me. "I haven't said anything yet." "I know," I said again. And I did know. The way you know the things that have already been decided by something deeper than the conscious mind, by the accumulated weight of weeks of honest attention paid in both directions, by the specific quality of a hand placed over yours at a waterfront table, by the evidence of a man who drove to Little Havana to look at a building you mentioned once and brought you Cuban coffee because you mentioned Versailles in a single sentence 3 weeks before. I knew. "Good night, Brandon," I said, and got out of the car. I did not look back from the lobby door, but I was smiling before I reached the elevator. Chapter 10. What was always hers. 6 weeks is not a long time. In the architecture of a life, in the long, accumulated weight of years of work and loss and rebuilding and the slow, patient construction of something worth standing inside, 6 weeks is barely a breath. It is a handful of Mondays, a few cycles of the tide. The time it takes for a Miami October to exhale itself into November, for the light to shift almost imperceptibly toward something softer, for the city to remember that it is capable of a gentleness that its summers make it easy to forget. But 6 weeks can also be the precise interval between the closing of one chapter and the full, unambiguous opening of another. I was alone in the penthouse floor of the Surf Club Four Seasons on a Wednesday afternoon when my phone rang and my accountant's name appeared on the screen for the second time in 4 minutes. I almost did not answer. I was standing in the middle of what would eventually become the primary residence suite. Raw concrete underfoot, temporary construction lighting overhead, the Atlantic filling every unfinished window with its vast, indifferent blue, and I was deep inside the particular focused state that the best work produces, where the room stops being a room and starts being a conversation between what exists and what is possible. I answered on the third ring, "Kerry." Gerald's voice had the quality it gets when he is trying to be professionally composed and finding it genuinely difficult. "I need you to confirm that you received the contract documentation from the Surf Club project office this morning." "I received it." "And you reviewed the commission figure?" "Gerald." "I just want to confirm that you reviewed it, because I have looked at it 4 times and—" "I reviewed it," I said. 4 times as well." A pause. "Kerry," he said, "this is the largest single commission in the history of your firm. I'm aware. By a significant margin." "Gerald, I'm going to need you to let me be excited about this for 30 more seconds." I smiled at the unfinished wall in front of me. "Take your time." He took approximately 45 seconds, during which he said several things about growth trajectories and market positioning that I absorbed with genuine appreciation, because Gerald had believed in the financial viability of my studio during months when belief had required a certain courage. He deserved his 45 seconds, and I gave them to him without interruption. After we hung up, I stood in the silence of the half-finished penthouse and let the reality of it land completely. The full Surf Club 4 Seasons redesign contract, 6 residential floors, a timeline extending 14 months, a budget that would require me to hire 2 full-time senior designers, expand my studio space, and build the kind of operational infrastructure that transforms a promising small firm into something with genuine permanence and reach. Everything I had been building toward since a folding table in a Brickell apartment. Everything I had continued building toward during 18 months, when the work was the only thing I was certain of. I set my phone face down on the windowsill and looked out at the Atlantic and breathed it in. The salt air coming through the frameless window openings, the sound of the construction crew on the floor below, the particular magnificent ordinariness of a Wednesday afternoon in Surfside, with the ocean doing what the ocean has always done and will always do, regardless of whether anyone standing at a window watching it has just received the most significant news of her professional life. I was still standing there when I heard the elevator. The doors opened at the far end of the corridor, and I heard footsteps, unhurried, familiar, the specific rhythm of a man who moves through spaces without announcing himself. And then Brandon appeared in the doorway of the unfinished suite with his jacket over one arm and a question about construction access ready on his face. He stopped when he saw me, not because my expression was dramatic. I was not crying, was not visibly overwhelmed, was not performing the moment in any way, but Brandon had spent 6 weeks learning the precise vocabulary of my interior states, and he read something in the quality of my stillness that made him pause in the doorway rather than continuing into the room. "The contract," he said. Not a question. "The contract," I confirmed. He crossed the empty floor toward me. His footsteps on the raw concrete were the only sound in the room. He stopped a few feet in front of me and looked at me with that direct, unhurried attention. The attention that had stopped me in a penthouse corridor 6 weeks ago and had not stopped since. "Gerald called twice," I said. "That sounds like Gerald." He needed 45 seconds to be excited. "Did you give them to him?" 47, I said. I was generous. The corner of his mouth moved. Then his expression settled into something more serious, not heavy, not somber, simply the quality of seriousness that a man carries when he has arrived at a moment he has been thinking about carefully and intends to be present inside it with complete honesty. "I came about the construction access schedule," he said. "I know. That is a genuine reason for being here." "I know that too." He looked at me for a moment. "Kerry." "Brandon, I have spent my adult life being deliberate," he said. about the things I build and the people I trust, and the decisions I allow to carry weight in my life. That deliberateness has served me well. It has protected me from significant errors. It has also cost me things that I understood only in retrospect that I should have moved toward more quickly. He paused. I did not fill the pause. I do not want to be deliberate about you, he said. I have tried, as a professional discipline, to approach whatever this is with the same measured patience I apply to everything else. And I have failed consistently and without regret for 6 weeks. The Atlantic filled the window openings around us. The construction noise from the floor below was a distant, rhythmic presence. The afternoon light was the particular gold of a surfside November afternoon, warm, slanted, the kind of light that makes every surface it touches look like something being remembered rather than simply seen. My father told me once, Brandon continued, that the only decision in his life he made without calculation was my mother. That he saw her on a street corner in Liberty City in 1974, with nothing in his pocket but intention, and he walked across that street before the deliberate part of his mind could construct a reason not to, and that everything, the company, the family, every good thing that followed, came from that single uncalculated step. He looked at me directly. I am not a man who quotes his father's romantic history to women in construction sites as a general practice, he said. I laughed. A real laugh, sudden and unconstrained, the kind that arrives without permission and announces that something in you has relaxed completely. I would hope not, I said. I am telling you because I want you to understand that this is not a performance, he said, and it is not a calculation. It is simply true. I choose you, Kerry, plainly, without reservation and without the footnotes that I normally attach to significant decisions. I looked at this man, standing in an unfinished room in a good suit with his jacket over his arm, and the Atlantic behind him and his father's story still settling in the air between us, and felt something complete itself in my interior. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical finality of a resolution that announces itself. Simply the quiet, permanent way of things that have been moving toward each other for long enough that the arrival, when it comes, feels less like a beginning than like a recognition. He had never tried to rescue me. He had never needed me to be smaller. He had never once looked at my ambition and found it inconvenient. He had brought me Cuban coffee because I mentioned a restaurant once. He had driven to Little Havana to look at a door I described in a single sentence. He had sat on a balcony with me the night before the most complicated morning of my recent life, and said nothing except what was true and necessary and kind. He had shown up, consistently, without theater, in the specific and irreplaceable way of a person who means what they do. Yes, I said. He had not finished his sentence. We both knew it, and neither of us addressed it, because the sentence did not require its ending, and the yes did not require its question, and sometimes two people have been paying close enough attention to each other that the formal structures of declaration and response become optional. He stepped forward, and I did not step back, and the distance between us closed in the simple, unhurried way of something that has been closing gradually for 6 weeks and has finally completed the journey. He held my face in his hands for a moment. Just that. Just his hands warm against my face and his eyes finding mine with the complete, unguarded directness of a man who is no longer being careful. And then he kissed me with a gentleness that contained, beneath the gentleness, everything that had been accumulating since a Surfside elevator opened, and a woman with a 40-page concept document told him what a space needed, that it didn't know it was missing. When we separated, the room was the same unfinished room it had been. Raw concrete and construction lighting, and the Atlantic in every window opening, and the sound of Miami going about its enormous, beautiful, indifferent business below us. But it was also entirely different. Rooms do that. They absorb what happens inside them and hold it in the walls and the light and the particular quality of air, so that what has been felt in a space leaves a trace that does not disappear when the people who felt it do. I knew this professionally. I had built my entire career on the understanding that rooms carry the weight of human life with a fidelity that goes beyond the merely decorative. This room would carry this. I turned back to the window. Brandon stood beside me. Miami spread below us in every direction, Surfside and Bal Harbor and the long Atlantic coastline running north toward a horizon that was turning slowly amber in the late afternoon, and to the south, the denser, more vertical skyline of Miami Beach, and beyond it, the suggestion of the city that had made us both. Liberty City, where I had grown up watching my mother build a life from discipline and love. Wynwood, where I had built my studio on a runway of 4 months and a refusal to be small. Brickell, where I had sat on a balcony the night before a wedding and said the true things I needed to say. And somewhere in the western part of the city, a street corner where a man with nothing in his pocket but intention had walked across the road in 1974 toward a woman he had chosen without calculation. I thought about the envelope, the cream stationery and the gold embossing and the small handwritten note card that Rovman Lewis had tucked inside it with such careful, calculated precision. I wanted you to see what happiness looks like. I looked out at the Atlantic. I felt Brandon beside me, steady, present, fully here. Rovman was right, I said quietly. Brandon looked at me. About the invitation, I said. He wanted me to see what happiness looks like. I let a moment pass. He just didn't understand that he wasn't the one who was going to show me. Brandon was quiet for a moment. Then he reached over and took my hand, simply without ceremony, the way you take the hand of someone you have chosen and intend to keep choosing, one ordinary and extraordinary day at a time. We stood in that half-finished room with all of Miami stretched out below us, and the light going gold over the Atlantic, and the future arranged in every direction, like a room that is finally, after all the necessary work, ready to be lived in. My name is Kerry Love. I was born in Liberty City. I built my firm from a folding table and 4 months of nerve. I received an invitation designed to humiliate me, and I walked through the door it pointed toward instead, and everything that waited on the other side of it was already mine. It always had been. A message from this story. The most powerful lesson Kerry Love teaches us is this: when someone sends you an invitation designed to remind you of what you have lost, look more carefully, because they may have accidentally drawn you a map to everything you were always meant to find. The people who underestimate you are not your enemies. They are, without knowing it, your navigators. Rovman did not break Kerry. He clarified her. He removed himself from a life he was never large enough to occupy beside her, and left the space clean and open for something real to enter. So if you are sitting tonight carrying the weight of someone who left you, someone who chose someone else, someone who told you that you were too much or not enough, hear this clearly. You were not too much. You were simply too whole for someone who was still assembling themselves. Your ending was not a verdict. It was a redirection. And the life waiting on the other side of your closed door is not a consolation prize. It is the original destination. Keep building, keep showing up, keep walking through the doors that your pain points toward. What is yours will not require you to shrink to receive it. What is yours already knows your name.